All right, let's get started. This is Jones Loflin. I am so excited that you have joined me today for this session on what to consider when shifting to a remote workforce with my guest, Jan Stewart. Reminder, we would ask you to mute your mics, and if you would like to mute your video as well. We will be taking formal questions at the end. I'm also going to be asking you to put questions into the chat as we go through our time today so that I can get those to Jan during our presentation as we go through today. Now, I want to start with a polling question very early day, even before I talk with Jan. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that poll up and kind of see what you're thinking and where you are right now. It kind of helps me to know. Here's my first couple questions for you that I'd love for you to answer. First question is, are you working from home now? And then the secondly is, did you work from home prior to COVID-19? So if you'll go ahead and give your answers there, appreciate that. Are you working from home now, and did you work from home prior to COVID-19? And based on the answers, it looks like most of you have responded now, so let me share those polling results. Wow, look at that. 91% of you are working from home now. 91% of you did not work from home prior to COVID-19. So it's been a big shift for you. And the reason that I wanted to offer this session today is because as many of you know, my focus is on time management, productivity, that sense of overload that people have. And some of you may be wondering, well, what's that got to do with shifting to a remote workforce? Well, certainly, I think that's the overload for a lot of my coaching clients and others that I'm talking to these days, is that they're really struggling with trying to figure out, should we continue remotely as a team or as a workforce, or is this something where we need to maybe not consider for the long term? And so I wanted to find someone who had those kinds of skills and experience in mind, and so I found my good friend Jan Stewart. Now, Jan has over 25 years of experience in working in the financial services industry. She's built and led remote teams for over 10 years. Now, building them is one thing. Managing them and leading them, as many of you have found out in this pandemic season, is quite another. So I'm so excited that Jan is here with us. She also has experience with analytics, working with these teams, they're managing customer service, so many facets that are important in that remote work environment. In addition, Jan and I share a common bond, is that we are both from North Carolina. Jan is currently not in North Carolina. She resides in Columbia, Missouri. And so, Jan, with that, I'm going to invite you to begin just kind of opening some things up about a little bit about you, and then we've got our first polling question before you get into that first point today. So, Jan, welcome.
All right. Thank you, Jones. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me today. And as a lot of things are in our lives, when we're doing them, we don't know really what it's preparing us for. And when I started leading remote teams, it wasn't because I set out to lead remote teams. It's because the people sat at a great distance from me. The people I managed sat 2 and 4 and 5 hours away from me. So I learned 10, 12 years ago how to work with people who you don't see every day and who aren't, sitting under your watchful, observant eye every day in the workplace. Little did I know it would be such a hot topic, many years later as we're facing a pandemic.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting that you didn't set out to build remote teams? It became a necessity because your people are far apart, and how do we make this work? How do we be effective in our role? So it's kind of like where we are now, is that it was a necessity, but now it's shifting. It's people have learned so much from that, from this experience, and still are, and now they're kind of going, maybe remote teams is something we should look at as opportunity versus just necessity. And so that's perfect for why I wanted you to be a part of this session today. All right, Jan, before you get into your key ideas, I want to start with a poll, or continue with polling, but start with a different poll. And that one very simply is kind of what's your interest in being a part of this session today. I'd like for all of you to take just a moment. What brings you to this session today that'll help Jan kind of know how she's going to temper her comments, her points today. So here's the question for this morning. What's your reason for being a part of this? And it's multiple choice, but take a moment now, if you would. What do you want to learn from today's session? So thank you. We've had a couple of you post your answer. If the rest of you would, that would be great, so we can see what it is that you're hoping to get out of today's session. So far, a lot of you are wanting to manage that remote team. And several of you are just an employee who wants to work remotely. So give you about another 5 seconds, and then we'll end the polling and share those results. Okay, thank you. So let me share those results. Here's what we got. What best describes your interest in today's session? I want to improve how I manage a remote team. 77% of you. So that tells me that you're managers or you're in that role right now. The second answer, 46%, I'm an employee who wants to work remotely. So you want to pick up some tips and ideas on how can I convince my boss, my supervisor, my team, my organization that I could do the job remotely. And then we have about 23% of you who need to have that discussion or want to have that discussion with your team members about whether they could or couldn't do the work. So thank you for sharing those thoughts. With that, Jan, you have created 5 fantastic consider statements for us today. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to that first slide and let you begin to talk about consider why the employee wants to work from home.
All right. Thank you, Jones. And it's a pleasure to be with all of you today. Thanks for joining in. So as to me, that as people started working from home and seeing what it could mean to them or to their work-life balance, that actually people might want to start working from home. I know there are a lot of people anxious to get back to the office, but there are some positive upsides, I believe, to remote work. So if an employee comes to you and expresses a desire to work from home, then understand why they want to work from home first, and don't assume, ask them. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of answers they could give you, which could have different responses from you or from your company. Somebody could say they want to continue to work from home because they are afraid of physical contact. They're just nervous about this pandemic and the spread of the virus and being in close proximity to other people and touching doorknobs and printers and things in the break room. And they're just nervous about physical contact in the workplace. Or they could tell you that they need to be home for childcare. Their childcare fell through for the summer and they need to be home for the next 2 months. Or they could tell you that they've realized how much more productive they are at home, how they've appreciated not having that long commute, how they've saved on gas, how they appreciated the flexibility of the work hours. Instead of getting in the car at 7 a.m. to make that 45, 50-minute commute, be at work by 8, they sat down and started working a little before 7. And they were realizing a greater work-life balance because of that. So you need to understand why. And each of those could have different responses. As we move through today, we're going to talk about the response when you as the employer are giving it consideration, that you're thinking about it. You believe it's a good idea for your organization and you'd like to consider it. So let's talk about, Jones, could it or should it be done remotely?
And before we go there, Jan, I've got a question for you. How you talk about consider why the employee wants to work from home. Give me an example of when you would not be you think a good reason for an employee to want to work from home. What, from your experience?
So the second example I gave, the child care. Okay. In a professional from home or remote work environment, that environment really should be a professional work environment that is in a secure space, a private space where work and conversation can be done in private. It is not a substitute for childcare. It shouldn't be that. You shouldn't have distractions. You should be able to work from home or remotely just as you would in the office, distraction free with a lot of productivity. That all changed when people, everyone, schools, everyone had to go home with COVID-19, and we saw dogs in the back of videos, or we saw children on people's laps during video conferences. But that is not how a professional remote workspace should be. And if you are having to provide attention and meals and care for a school-age child that needs childcare, you can't be productive and professional in the workspace, in the workplace. So that would be an example of where that's really not when someone needs to be working from home.
Right. No, excellent example, and one that, sometimes it's being the manager, and that's not really the scope of our time together today, maybe for another time, but is being able to have that conversation
That's right.
and literally ferret out or help them to see that that's not a healthy reason to want to, work in that remote environment would be important. So thank you for that. All right. So let's move on to the one you said. Consider if the job could or should be done remotely. Talk a little bit about that.
So I think about three things. I think about the job, I think about the person, and I think about the company or organization. So let's think about the job. Can that job be done remotely? And I'll give you an example from the financial services industry. A bank teller. A bank teller job, the bank teller is handling cash. They are greeting customers across a teller line and cashing checks. That job cannot be done remotely. On the other hand, a loan underwriter whose entire workflow, the work they receive and then their output of work, is all through the computer. They can as easily do it at their desk at home as they can at their desk at the office. That's an example of a job that could be done remotely. When I think about the person, remote work really is not cut out for everybody. And you need to think about, is this a person who has had previous performance issues or existing performance issues? Have there been concerns with prioritization, their ability to prioritize, or issues with productivity? Are they a self-starter? So you have to consider the person. And then your company. Can your company or your organization accommodate this? Do you have the technical infrastructure to accommodate it? Are your managers trained in a way, or do you have the ability to get them trained to manage people remotely? What if you do send people out? Then do you have space now to bring them all back in? Because you do need to come back in and see each other from time to time. And that's perfectly fine when you work remotely. Once you go remote, you don't have to stay remote. You can still come back together for meetings or different things. So remote's just an option, and there are different ways and degrees that you can go remote. So three things: the job, the person, and the organization.
Yeah. And I love what you just said there, is that just because you go remote doesn't mean you have to stay remote. We've been trial by fire in this current season of remote work, but we don't have to, work. Some are coming back, some, are shifting, but it is really kind of an experiment that you can try if you've begun to build certain things out that you want to do, to try in that remote environment. But it really does have to start a little more experimental, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
Yes. I
Yeah.
think it's hard to go um, well, to do it well, um, all in. You know, it is something I think you sort of have to get your feet wet in.
Right.
We went all in. We had to because of the pandemic, but I think if we had our choice, we wouldn't go that way probably.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. So, no, great point. So, all right. So that leads us to your third consider, and is how could the job be accomplished by a remote workforce? And I have a polling question here. Just kind of curious where our participants are today and what they're thinking about. And so, let me bring up that polling question. Get up to that third question. Third question is, which of the following components of a remote workforce do you feel most unprepared to create or manage? I mean, many of you today said, hey, I'm on here today because I want to learn how to better manage a remote team. And I'd like to hear from you. What is it that concerns you the most? What do you feel unprepared to create or manage in a remote workforce? So I'll give you a few seconds there to give us your thoughts. Thank you to the those of you who have answered the poll. Well, the rest of you can continue. What is it that you feel unprepared to create or manage? Unprepared to create or manage. Thank you for those of you who are answering. Give it a few more seconds because I do want to hear from as many as possible. It helps us kind of see what's on your mind today. So thank you for that. We'll give it about another 5 seconds. 71% of you have responded so far. And so I think we'll end the polling and we will share those results. Here's what you said. 40% of you said what I feel most unprepared for is the infrastructure. And then 20% was both policy and guidelines, communications, and then 10% of you said schedule and time reporting. And personally, one that was a bit of a surprise to me was the time reporting one, because I would have thought that would have been a bigger one for some of you. But it's always interesting that we all have different challenges or things that we're looking at when it comes to building this remote workforce. So Jan, I'm going to drop that, and I'm going to bring up the slide that has these words on it, because you nailed it. You said these are the kinds of things that we got to look at. Talk to us about the items I see on the screen as it relates to considering how this job gets done.
So I agree with the respondents. I think the infrastructure is the most critical piece to figure out. And when I think about infrastructure, the first thing is, has somebody got a laptop? And that's an easy way to send someone home. But as you think about doing it for a longer period of time and doing it well, do they need a monitor and a keyboard and a mouse? And depending on how much they're going to work from home, are they going to need a printer and a scanner? Do you have a system network that is going to accommodate this? Do you have a VPN, a virtual private network? What about cybersecurity? Are your folks trained on how to be cautious around in the face of cyber criminals today, phishing emails and business email compromise? And do we have multi-factor authentication about letting people sign into our systems and knowing that they do have the right access to sign in? It's really critical to partner with your IT department and to lean on them. You've got to depend on your IT department. You may have systems at work that you don't have access to remotely. And that's something that your IT department is going to have to make the determination on. That's not going to be something that you can change yourself. You can probably have some influence and impact on maybe their decision making. And if that's the case, if there's systems that maybe you don't have access to remotely now, I think now is a great time to bring that up. We were forced to go home and we made do, but when we have to go home again, when we need to work remotely again, are we going to be prepared to completely and fully do our job? Can we get this system? And it could be something that takes, 6 months or 18 months to do. But if your company could get to thinking about that and working toward that now and seeing how you could move wholly remotely if you had to. Other infrastructure, is your email, your ability to video conference. What's your video conferencing app you use? How about just conference calling apps? What about the ability to answer the phone when someone calls into your company and to answer that remotely? And how do you place a phone call? And that phone call be from your company phone, or at least your company phone number, and not from your employee's personal cell phone. So do you have a soft phone where you can actually leverage the laptop and make phone calls that way? We talked about the cybersecurity of the information on your system, but also if you have printed material that you have at home with you, or if you end up printing at home through your company's printer scanner device, then what do you do with that information, that document? Do you have an ability to shred? So keeping information secure is really important. And then you have to think about the workflows. Is the workflow such that people can do it from home? How would it work? Do you need to change a workflow a little bit to accommodate a remote work? And then communication, and that really gets into the long term of working from home. How do we communicate, and how does that change? Questions there, Jones, or do you want me to move ahead and talk about schedule?
Well, I think I am going to let you go ahead and talk about schedule. And to those of you who are listening, I would invite you, if you've got questions related to these 5 different areas as we go through, just go ahead and put them in the chat box, and I will I'll pull them out. I've had a couple people send me some things privately, but I'll pull them out after you've kind of touched on all 5, Jan, so that we can kind of have a broader picture, and then maybe get more specific with some of them.
Okay. So when I refer to schedule, I'm thinking about how deep are we going into remote work? Are we going to allow people to work from home as needed? Maybe someone says, I have a package being delivered that I have to sign for from 1 to 4. I'd like to work from home today so I don't have to take a half day of vacation just to be at home. Or maybe somebody says, or maybe you're thinking, now that this has seemingly worked out so well for your organization, you may be thinking that you could divest yourself of a little real estate. You could size down if you could figure out a way to have workspace sharing and let Group A work from home Mondays and Wednesdays and every other Friday, and Group B work from home Tuesday, Thursday, and then every other Friday, and then share that workspace in the office. So if you could have some sort of part-time, part-staff remote work, or could you just realize we don't even need to come into the office and really work toward completely moving to a remote workforce? So you've got to think about, what are you aiming for? And then that will help sort of gauge some of the other things you do. When I talk about policy and guidelines, policy is something that's mandatory, it's required, and you probably would need a statement or two in your employee policy, in your company policy manual about remote work. And it might be something as simple as, all remote work requires manager approval. Maybe it's just one simple statement. But then your guidelines, that's really where you get into a document that sort of outlines how remote work is done, what it looks like, the way you communicate it, certain things for your department. And it could be 1 page, it could be 4 pages. Again, depending on how deep into remote work you go. An example of a guideline would be work from home is not a substitute for child care or elder care. That'd be an example of a guideline. Time reporting. That is important because it's a federal regulation. So under the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, those employees who are non-exempt, which means that if they work over 40 hours, then they are eligible for overtime and they must be paid for working over 40 hours. If you have those non-exempt employees working from home, you must be very clear with them about their requirement of properly reporting their work, the time that they work. And so if they tend to log back in at night, just like they see other exempt employees doing, then they've got to put that time down. And so you have to be real clear around your expectations for the time it takes to get their job done and how long you expect them to work on things, whether it's an 8-hour day or 40-hour week, if overtime is allowed. You've got to be very clear on that because they've got to understand the importance of if they work the time, they've got to put it down and they've got to be paid for it. Communication. I think that's one of the most common things we talk about because it changed so much for us. We were used to stopping by somebody's workstation and speaking to them in the morning, and then all of a sudden, if we spoke to them, it was because we picked up the phone and called them, or we spoke to them via email in the morning because we weren't sitting in the office together anymore. And so you really do have to think about how you're going to communicate as a team, how employees and managers will communicate with each other, rhythms of check-ins and one-on-ones, what team meetings will look like. Are there going to be certain parameters for if it's a team meeting, then it's by video conference. If it's a meeting with a certain number of people, we can do it by conference call. Really understanding how you want to communicate and then setting those expectations with your team.
Wow. Jan, when you started this section, it was amazing, all the private chats that came to me and said, hey, could I get this? What about this? What about that? One of the great questions we had was, where does one go to get like sample policies or guidelines? I mean, because there's so much on this screen in front of me right now that's got to be considered. I mean, where do you go to get help on something like that?
There are various resources out there. In fact, there's so much about remote work these days. You could just Google remote work or leading a remote team and find a lot of articles. Your HR department should be able to help you with this. You shouldn't be alone in trying to craft policy for your company. Guidelines could very well come out of your own experiences working from home and what you've recognized as reasonable, what you desire for your team, maybe as an employee, what you desire. We have seen where employees, teammates got together and came up with the guidelines they wanted for their team or for their department. There's also an organization, the Center for Leadership Studies. It's also the Center for Situational Leadership. You could check out their website, and they actually have some handbooks, some information on remote work and returning to work and some things like that. Harvard Business Review, HBR, might be a resource for you as well.
Okay. Excellent. And
If you feel like you're going it alone, if you say, well, I don't have an HR department, if you feel like it's critical and you're concerned about what you say or what you don't say in a policy, you can always consult legal counsel who deals in employment law. But when it comes to guidelines, just set what is right for your organization and your team.
yeah, and I love that breakdown there. And in fact, of policy and guidelines. Policy is what it says. It's HR, it's organizational, and you do need to go seek help with that from someone. And just by asking the question, people start saying, "Oh yeah, well we've got a series of policies on that or something." It's asking for help.
Yeah.
But then the guideline side, you're right, is so much about that team, the department, and coming up with what works for all of them, because what works for, let's say, an IT department might be different than a marketing or a customer service or some other role within the organization. But it is getting very specific, and I would imagine it would get more buy-in from the team if they were involved in setting these guidelines.
Absolutely. You hit it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's move on then. I don't want to run out of time today before we get some questions. One of the things, consider the challenges. You put this one in. You said, okay, you do all these things, but then you got to be thinking about what the challenges are. So what I'm going to invite you to do, for those of you who are listening, if you would look in the chat box and type in what you think some of the challenges are to working remotely. What are some of the challenges that you see in developing this remote workforce? I'll give you some time to chat those in. What are some of the challenges that you see? One that was sent to me privately earlier, Jan, while we're waiting for some response in the chat box. It says, what do I do if I can't trust them to do their work? In other words, that's the challenge they're saying. I can't trust them to do their work. What's your response?
My short response is, if you can't trust your employee to work from home, then you've probably got the wrong person on your team. um, that's a challenge. If you can't trust them to work from home, you're going to need to manage that more closely. Maybe consider why you don't trust them. Is their history with that employee? If there is, then maybe this is not an employee who needs to work from home. And in many organizations, the ability to work from home is a privilege. And it's not everyone gets to work from home. So it could be something that you really have to manage just one-on-one with that employee.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. It's a one-on-one thing. And I like what you said, it's not that everyone gets to, it's a privilege. You've proven yourself, or you've proven your ability to get your work done in whatever environment. And so then you have the opportunity to work remotely. In that sense. Kind of along that same line, we had a comment from someone to me privately, said, how do you assure staff are accountable for work time? Kind of goes back a little bit to that last question, but this was a little different. How do you assure staff are accountable for work time?
Yes, that is a question. Again, it gets back due in part to trust. And when it comes to time and working at home, I think that's something that you have to just be really upfront about, particularly when you are dealing with non-exempt hourly employees who are paid by the hour as such, or paid to get 40 hours of work done. I think you just have to be upfront early on about working from home, recognizing that they have the ability to have some flexible work time, and that you're trusting them to acknowledge, for example, if they needed to leave for a couple of hours to go do something, that they report it that way, that they take a couple of hours of sick time or vacation or unpaid, and then come back and work, or recognizing that they are going to only put down the hours that they work, and if they work more, they're going to put more. So it really does come down to trust when you're talking about that, but also getting at the heart of you've got to be honest and true about your time reporting.
Yeah, both sides of that. So yeah, that's a great answer. We had another comment coming about interacting with team members, collaborating together. That's a challenge because it's not maybe the same feel, or it just doesn't work the same as it has. Jan, you've been involved with these remote teams for a decade. How do you maintain that level of interaction that connects people, and so that you do feel like you've got a good collaborative environment to get projects done?
That's a big one, and you do have to be intentional about overcoming the feeling that we can't have camaraderie and we can't collaborate. So you really do have to be intentional about presenting your team and setting up opportunities for your team to work together. And some examples of that would be pairing two people together to work on a project, setting maybe some individuals, establishing individuals as experts in certain areas so that all the other teammates go to them for questions on that subject. And one of the great things about being together in the office is how we share about ourselves personally. We talk about our weekends, we talk about our pets, we talk about books or movies we've read or seen. And you do need to have that on your team meetings, whether it's video conference or conference call. You do need to allow for time for that, because that really is how you get to know each other. And in fact, when I was building teams, I was very intentional about giving people opportunities repeatedly to introduce themselves, to tell things about themselves, to share, whether it's vacations or favorite books or hobbies, and not just doing it that first week the team was together or the first time that person joined the team, but again and again, periodically bringing up some things that lighten the meeting. It's not all serious work all the time, every minute, but 5-10 minutes in a meeting to talk about something that really gets you to feel like you know your other teammates.
Yeah, personal, making that personal connection with each other, even in the virtual environment. And I like what you said. It's being intentional about that. We don't assume it's going to happen. We have to be the ones to create that space for that to happen in those environments. Because if not, then it creates challenges. I really like what you said too about identifying who's the expert or the go-to person on a particular project, and inviting them, say, reach out, talk, as twos or as threes or as fours. I think that's really a key one. So thank you for that one. One other one, then we're going to move on to our final one. Somebody said about email etiquette. That's one of the challenges. Is I've heard that from lots of people who are working remotely right now. Is like, I get more email than I've ever gotten before. How do you manage that in a remote environment, a remote workforce, Jan?
So when you move to a remote workforce, you need to think about some of the things you need to train your team on. And you might need to revisit communication styles. And I'll use styles in two ways. How do we choose to communicate? Do we use a video conference? Do we use a mere conference call? Do we do it by email? Do we send somebody a quick instant message? Or do we pick up the phone and call them? What method do you use for that subject, for that matter, for this situation that you want to talk and deal with that person on? And then the style with which you use it. When you are in person with someone, whether it's stopping by somebody's workstation or office or together in a meeting, we've got the benefit of body language. We've got the benefit of facial expressions. And we don't have that nearly as well in video conference, not well at all in conference calls, and then it's almost lost in email. And so curt emails, short emails where somebody is acting quickly can sound curt, or sound like somebody is defensive or being offensive. And so you do need to train again on methods and styles of communication.
Yeah, and I love what you just said. We don't have the benefit of body language or facial expression, and we forget that so much of what we communicate is nonverbal. And so, if we're sending, like you said, that very pert email or message in some way over Slack or some other device, people can receive that in a way that was totally not intended at all. And in fact, I heard a guy from the Disney Institute in a session years ago say, in any type of communication, we should always enter on the human side and exit on the human side. And that's what I hear you saying, is that, remember, whether it's an email or whatever you're sending, you're talking to a human being. And I love the idea of imagining that they are in front of me when I'm sending the email, so that I can, I've got my video turned off, but I'm actually changing my body language, because I'm thinking about, well, if I'm going to send that email to that person, then I need, I'm going to kind of lean forward or whatever, because that's what I do if I pass by their desk or their workspace. But I love that, is just kind of keeping that in mind. You don't have the benefit of body language or facial expression. So how can you create that in the communication that you're making? I think that's fantastic. So thank you for that. All right, let's get to our last consider of the 5, and this one's considered a win-win. I've got a poll that I want to bring up for this one about that whole idea, and so let me get to that question. And I'm just curious, from those of you who are listening today, what do you see as the primary benefit of a remote team or workforce? What do you see as the primary benefit of a remote team or workforce? And you can check as many as you think are important here, but what do you see as the benefit? So I'll give you a chance to make your comments here. What do you see as the benefit? Primary benefit of a remote team or workforce. See the answers showing up. Thank you for putting your answers in. I would invite some of the rest of you to go ahead and put your answers in, so we can kind of get a feel for where the group is at. I see one of the ones that's near and dear to my heart showing up a lot, but I'll withhold that answer until we finish the poll. If a couple of the rest of you would like to chime in, that would be great. Thank you for that. If we get a couple more, I appreciate that. I'll say thank you to all of you who've clicked in on the polling today. It helps us to kind of see what you're thinking, and helps Jan kind of know what's she'd like to share. So with that, I think we've got most of you who have done that. So let me share the results on this. 100% of you said you like the benefit of work-life balance. So of course, as someone who that's what I love to train and teach on, then that warms my heart. Then as I look down the list, 45% of you said retention. 27% of you said cost. And then I look at the ones that got the least responses, and they're things like engagement and loyalty and recruitment. And it's, yeah, Jan's laughing because she's going, yeah, I've got a couple things to say about that. And so Jan, I'm going to take a moment of personal privilege here. Whenever you gave me this list, and one of the ones you had on here was engagement, I'm like, engagement? Jan, they're working remotely, and you got a remote. How does that help with engagement? So I'm going to ask the personal privilege that jump off and talk a little bit about engagement, and then you can bounce around to some of these other ones that are there for us.
Sure. So engagement is probably my favorite, because let's mention morale. So when we think about morale, and I do think that it helps employees' morale, it helps with their feeling about their work and their satisfaction about work. But when you talk about engagement does include morale. That's a piece of engagement. But engagement is that confidence, that satisfaction that one feels about their work. It's their feelings about leadership. It's their feelings about their own value that they bring to the workplace and to their employer and their organization. And then it's measured in impact and influence, and particularly productivity. And so I've seen the value of an engaged workforce. and an engaged team. And I believe that when you allow people to have the ability to work from home, it improves their engagement.
Excellent.
Anything you want me to add on that?
No, 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 no,
I
no,
just
no.
think I just think it's one thing that a company can do that really adds to their engagement.
Yeah, and that was fascinating to me because you're the one who has the experience with that, and you get that, and so that one's really uh, effective. Talk about the cost for a moment, about win-win, because some of the technical sides of this whole thing could be seen. Well, it could actually be seem like the upfront cost would be even more, but talk about the cost side of the win-win.
So the cost side for the employee is pretty nice. They save on gas. Long term, they might save on their wardrobe. They probably save on some of their lunch money and snack money. But for the employer, if it's something that you allow your employee to do when they need to, or when you need them to in an emergency, a hurricane, a tornado's blown the roof off the building and you need people to go home and work, then the cost of that sort of intermittent, episodic, as needed work from home scenario has really minimal cost to the manager. And when you can get a lift in morale because people feel like they've got some control over their own work life, when you can get a added benefit in engagement, the engagement of your employee, their willingness to give you more because they see that you're giving them that freedom to work from home and you trust them to work from home, and they're getting that added benefit of this work-life balance, the no commute, that type of thing, then the cost in that scenario is pretty minimal for the employer. It does get to be greater if you think about implementing things for a deeper remote workforce. No doubt about that. Long term, if you give up some leases on buildings or sell some real estate, it might once again be a win for you.
Sure. Yeah, that's great. So, all right. Any of the others of these that maybe I missed the engagement one, but any of the other ones of these that might be kind of a surprise to people that you've learned in working with and building remote teams, that's a win that maybe initially you hadn't thought about?
I would like to speak to recruitment. And as you think about the generation of workers that are entering the workforce now, if you think about how they have gone to school, many of them did a portion of their high school from home. They did it online by computer. All of them did some sort of college online. Even if they were living on a college campus, they took some online courses from their dorm room or from their apartment when they wanted to, or at a time they chose. Often they didn't have to be in the seat from 8 to 5 in their classroom taking a course, or at their school building or college hall taking a course. And now to expect them to come into the workforce and sit at your company from 8 to 5 and at your desk from 8 to 5 every day is going to be a limiting factor when somebody will let them have some flexibility. So I think as companies moving forward, we've got to think about it with our newest generation of people in the workforce.
And what a great point, Jan, because I mean, I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, even my daughter Sydney, who's 16, is taking some, online classes through the community college this summer. And yes, some of her, high school education will be done that way. And they have that expectation that they have that flexibility.
That's
and
right.
then they come up against an organization that says, well, no, that's something we're kind of looking at. Or if you need to, work from home, well, yeah, you'll be okay. I could just see somebody going, versus an organization that says, our goal is to get the work done. And we want to figure out how the most efficient, effective way is to do that for both the organization and the individual, and to make sure we're providing service. And so, yes, we have a plan where blah, blah, blah. I mean, man, I could just see where that person would go, yeah, I want to be a part of that organization because they respect the way I've learned or the way I want to live in the way they carry out their company. So yeah, that's huge. All right, so as we begin to get to the end of our time together today, you see if there's some other questions. I've had a couple privately come in, but I'll wait and see if there's some other things that might come in. Jan has been so kind to say, hey, here's my contact information, ways to connect with me on LinkedIn. Jan, you mentioned that you're available for consultation regarding managing and leading remote workforce related to some of the subjects you talked about today. Because as I said, that one slide about infrastructure and those things, we could have spent the whole time on that one because there's so many considerations that people might have. I do have one question that I do want to somebody ask about, and we thought it might. If you've noticed today, so much of our session has been around the technical side, the logistical side, the process side. The one thing we haven't talked about is the culture side, because that, as Jan and I talked in our pre-session, we could spend a whole session on that. And so the question came into me privately, says, I don't know how we can maintain our company culture if we have a remote workforce. Jan, what can you share with us about that?
Yes, culture is really important as you think about separating your employees and losing that in-person contact that they have with each other and that you have with them. I would ask, though, that you think about how did your culture permeate your team and permeate through your organization when you were all under one roof. And if you were successful doing that, I would suggest that you can still do it remotely. And I'll give two examples. If your organization, or if you believe that just being shoulder to shoulder in cubicle to cubicle, office to office with people creates a positive culture, that's not just what does it. Or an annual outing, fun team building outing, that is not alone what creates culture. Culture is your mission, your purpose, your values, your principle of your organization, that from the top of your organization through every level of leadership and management, through every part of that organization permeates, so that everybody, regardless of the team, regardless of the department, regardless of the manager you have, everyone is speaking that same language and is holding each other accountable with those same values and principles. And an example of where you might have done it in person was, from time to time in a team meeting, you asked individuals to affirm how they saw a value or principle at work, maybe with some partners or during a project or within your team for something you were working on. And really just what I call connecting the dots of those values to what your team is doing, and keeping that all the time in the forefront of your team's mind, not in a phony way, but being a leader who's genuine and authentically believes in the culture of your organization. And if you don't believe in it, your team will realize you don't believe in it. So if you're not carrying the culture yourself in person, in the workplace, you're not going to be carrying it remotely. So those things that you do to affirm it and have your teammates affirm it in person, you can still do that through conference calls, video calls, team meetings, one-on-ones that you have with them. Use those terms, affirm where you saw them living out your culture.
Yeah. Wow. It's not that it can't be done. You just have to be intentional. And think about how you carry it out. And again, great comment. If we think that sitting side by side in the workplace has created culture, we've got bigger problems already, because we need to figure out, what is the culture we want to create, and whether it's remotely or whether it's in the physical workspace, we should be working to create that, taking those small steps, like you said, every day to do that. With that, we are at 56 minutes past the hour. I had a couple questions that we're not going to be able to get to today, but I'll certainly respond to you offline.